Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
You sift your memory for beginnings.
The truth.
You send your mind ahead for directions.
Truth.
But all you really know is now, and you are lost in the present.
And what is the truth?
Well, now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it. Kind of anxious to get to it, are you? Whatever.
Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast, where we try to figure out who we are by looking at where we've been and what we've done. And as I often say, attempting to resurrect sense and meaning from the dust of a billion factoids. It's great to be back. Hope you've been having a very good summer. I know I have been. It's been hard to get together one of these monologue episodes. They take a little longer than the interviews. As I've been able to travel, as the restrictions have eased, fortunately I've had some very good guests to interview. But then I had to find out that being vaccinated does not protect you from a far more deadly and insidious virus, the man cold. Of course, I'm kidding. But I did struggle through a man cold last week. I forgot what it was like to feel sick at all. With the masking and the social distancing, I haven't even caught a cold in over 18 months. So apparently it was quite a shock to my weakened immune system to be exposed to a virus again. But anyway, things are back on track. We're going to start a new series, an uplifting series based upon some of the most infamous events in human history. This time we're going to be talking about the Inquisition. And let me just say right at the outset, that expression, the Inquisition, can be very misleading if we're talking about historical events, because there was no one Inquisition. There were many different Inquisitions, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years in many cases. The word itself, Inquisition, just comes from the Latin term for an inquiry or investigation. And there were many of these inquiries or investigations into various forms of witchcraft, heresy, apostasy throughout the centuries. But when we say the Inquisition, in capital letters, the Inquisition, we're talking about one of several powerful offices set up within the Catholic Church throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period in Europe and the Americas. Little known fact, the Inquisition was active in the New World. We'll get to that later. And the purpose of these inquisitions was to discover and root out various forms of heresy and the heretics who practice heresy. Now, heresy is so awful, so malignant, that an entire powerful office in the Catholic Church was needed to root it out. So we need to know what this heresy is. The word itself comes from the Greek word hereses, and it meant a thing chosen. So in Greek culture or society, there were many schools of thought, many philosophies, and the term heresies was used in conjunction with young people going through these various philosophies, various schools of thought, and deciding which one made sense, which one they wanted to follow, how they wanted to live. And as such, in Greek culture, it wasn't really a term of condemnation. But unfortunately, what was good for the Greeks was not necessarily good for the Christians. As the Christian church grew and gained power, it established a body of accepted beliefs. These were called orthodox beliefs. Orthodox meaning straight or correct teachings. So the Greek idea that you could pick and choose from among various teachings and decide which one you wanted to follow was certainly out of sync with that. So heresy came to be known as any belief or any system of belief or theory that was strongly at variance with accepted, established church teachings. A heretic, of course, is someone who embraced heresies. That's different, by the way, from an apostate. An apostate renounces their religion altogether. It would be someone who said, I am no longer a Christian. I am no longer a Catholic. That's apostasy, standing away from your former belief system. Heretics did not explicitly renounce their faith. They still claimed, in this case, to be good Christians. They just believed and practiced things that were not accepted by the church. So the question naturally arises, who decides what a heresy is? And of course, the short answer is people with power. So in other words, if you join yourself to some community of opinion, some system of belief, those in power in that community, whether it be political, religious, academic, whatever it is, they decide what's heretical and what isn't. Unfortunately, in pretty much every community of faith and belief and opinion that we know of, that is fluid, that changes. Today's heresy will be tomorrow's orthodoxy. Today's unacceptable teaching will be tomorrow's accepted doctrine. In the Middle Ages, in the times of the Inquisition, that power resided in councils, groups of powerful religious leaders who would meet together and decide what was heresy, who was a heretic, and who wasn't. When you think about it, that's a stunning amount of power to arrogate to yourself. That you individually or meeting together as a body can decide what is acceptable for people to believe and practice throughout all of Europe. But of course, we don't have to be uncomfortable with that level of power because, as Voltaire pointed out, quote, all councils are infallible because they are composed of men, end quote. Certainly no sarcasm there. Despite the wise pronouncement of all these various councils, the human mind is ever reprobate and rebellious, so heresy sprang up all over Europe throughout all ages, and the Inquisition was set up to counter, to root out, to discover, and exterminate these heresies and the heretics who practice them. So today we're going to be talking about some of the earliest instantiations of the Inquisition, the now universally maligned, pretty much considered evil and abusive, but at the time ruthlessly effective tool for enforcing accepted patterns of thought and practice. Most historians would say the first office of the Inquisition in the Catholic Church was set up officially, more or less officially, in the late 1100s, so the late 12th century. And it continued in various regions, in various forms, for the next 700 years or so. When most people think about the Inquisition, they think about the Spanish Inquisition, probably because it was the most ruthless, violent, arguably corrupt, and pseudo-reluctantly sadistic manifestation of the Inquisition. I guess you could call it the industry standard for inquisitions, thought to have killed between 30 and 130,000 heretics. That's a wide range, but it depends on the historian. And let me just say right at the outset of this series, lest we be accused of singling out Catholics unfairly, I will say Protestants, under Zwingli, Luther, Calvin, etc., they had their own methods for controlling dissent, controlling heresy. Frankly, there's a long and sordid history of thought policing from various groups, suppressing independent thought, punishing its proponents, tossing away books, burning books that they found threatening or didn't agree with, and just generally attempting to crush or channel the human spirit of curiosity and free inquiry into less threatening forms of thought. But when we talk about the Inquisition, we're talking about the medieval and early modern office of the Catholic Church. And as we begin the discussion, it's important to realize why the Inquisition arose at the time and in the place that it did. So what was going on around the time of the beginnings of the First Inquisition? Well, one change was that there was a trend of popular heretical movements that rejected traditional Catholic teachings, but even more threatening, rejected the traditional Catholic power structure, the hierarchy. One of the side effects of the Crusades that we don't often talk about is that it exposed Western Europeans to many other systems of thought and belief. You remember from the previous episode on the Crusades, as the Western Europeans traveled to the east to Constantinople during the First Crusade, they were going to the Byzantine Emperor to help the Emperor Alexius I Komnenos against the Seljuk Turks. So this uprooted the lords and soldiers and their entourage from the lands they'd lived on for generations. It exposed them to other ideas. And some of those ideas came from the Paulicians. The Paulicians were a movement in Eastern Christianity that had elements of Zoroastrianism, probably because of its proximity to former Persian lands. So the Paulicians adopted some of the beliefs of dualism, like Zoroastrianism, that there were two gods, good God and a bad God, in constant conflict, one against the other. More on that later. The point is, these crusaders brought some of the ideas from the East back with them to Europe. Another group they would have encountered in Bulgaria were the Bogomils. They were also dualists. They believed that God had two sons, one that was rebellious and one that was righteous, and that these two sons were in constant conflict. So these ideas clashed with the traditional Christian accepted Orthodox belief of an omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, monotheistic deity. And we'll go into some of its later manifestations. But the point is, as people traveled, as they became exposed to new ideas, heresies were entering Europe, into the realms under Catholic control. So the onset of heretical movements is one factor in the beginnings of the Inquisition. The next followed from the first. That is, there were many persecutions, campaigns of persecution against the heretics. What surprises many people, including me, I have to admit, is that these persecutions against heretics were not orchestrated initially by the church. In fact, the early church response was to try to preach to these heretics and save their souls, turn them back to the right way. The initial violent, suppressive, and often murderous response to heretics came from the lords, the kings, the noblemen. In other words, the secular authorities were the ones who were violently persecuting heretics within their kingdoms, often without any type of judicial process whatsoever. Kings and lords began to persecute anyone and everyone they wanted to, often in a mob-affected, brutal, and sloppy process. In fact, what trials there were like something out of a Monty Python skit, trials by ordeal, instead of trials where you carefully weigh and consider the evidence. And soon these persecutions spread to whomever the secular authorities thought was an undesirable. Jews, lepers, people with other diseases, prostitutes, homosexuals, anybody they wanted to eradicate from their kingdom, they would subject to a trial by ordeal and persecute them relentlessly. These persecutions became so common and so ubiquitous that the historian Bob Moore, R.I. Moore, said at the time Europe was best defined as a persecution society. That was the tool which rulers used to control their population. So that was another change underfoot in Europe at the time. Persecutions were on the increase. Another change was less fortunate. That is, the church's attitude toward heresy became less forgiving, less generous. Instead of looking at heretics as poor, misguided souls, by the end of the 11th century, the church began to think of heresy as, quote, deliberate rejection of the truth, end quote. So these were no longer confused and misled people. These were obstinate, willful, and evil people who were choosing heresy over the truth. And so, of course, along with this perception of heretics as willful and obstinate, the attitude toward how to deal with heresy also became harsher. Through the early Middle Ages, the church was very reluctant to turn heretics over to secular authorities, knowing that they would often be killed. And the clergy wanted to protect these souls. As I said, they wanted to save those souls. But that response shifted. The Council of Montpellier in 1062 and the Council of Toulouse in 1119 both decreed that heretics must be handed over to secular powers for coercive punishments. Even after those two decrees, most bishops thought that that would be participating in the shedding of blood, and they refused to turn heretics over to secular powers. But the church began to exert much more pressure on these reluctant bishops after 1148 and the Council of Reims. And if I'm butchering that pronunciation, please forgive me. It looks like rhymes to me. But the 1148 Council of Reims put much more pressure on the bishops. It mandated that they overcome their scruples about turning heretics over to the secular authorities. The event that brought that pressure to bear, that brought the situation to a head, was the trial of a famous arch-heretic, heresiarch, prophet, magician, and pretend messiah named Ian de la Toile. I will just call him Ian of the Star from now on, because that's what his name meant. His story is interesting in its own right. He was born to a noble family, and he took up early in his life the vows of an Augustinian monk and lived for a while as a hermit. But a hermetic life is not for everyone, and the mind of Ian of the Stars was not strong enough to be left to its own devices for long periods of time. It began to turn on itself. Around 1140, he attended a mass and he heard the priest say the words, quote, by him whose it is to judge the living and the dead, quote, obviously referring to Jesus. But Ian of the Stars interpreted that saying as applying to himself, decided that he was a prophet and Messiah. He began to spread the word. He inhabited an old priory, began to preach, and drew to himself many faithful followers who would meet with him at his priory. Early on, the Catholic Church authorities didn't take his movement very seriously. In fact, they considered him, quote, an illiterate idiot, end quote. But Ian of the Stars became renowned for his magic. He supposedly had a glow of magic surrounding him at all time. He had the ability to be in many places at once, and he and his followers began to indulge in a very hedonistic lifestyle, having sumptuous feasts and handing great riches to poor peasants. So, of course, he drew followers. Who wouldn't follow a magic glowing man who gives you great feasts and tons of riches when you're living in squalor and muck and barely getting enough food to live on? The problem is the way that he got these feasts and gifts to give to his followers. That, of course, the Catholic Church could not overlook, because Ian de la Toile, Ian of the Stars, and his followers would attack clergy, noblemen, various rich monasteries, steal everything from it, and then redistribute it to the poor. They became so successful and so wealthy in this thievery that they began to wear the highest finery. They ate lavishly. They called themselves angels and apostles. And they didn't spend a lot of time talking about mundane topics like living a just life, following God's commandments, etc. No, they spent most of their time talking about the coming Parousia, the second coming, when God would once again come to earth, destroy all the wicked, and install Ian of the Stars and his followers to their rightful place as the head of everyone and everything. Now I have to pause for a moment to explain where Ian of the Stars got his epithet of the stars. A comet appeared in the year 1148. Comets were generally considered bad omens in the Middle Ages, signifying the downfall of some illustrious person. Of course, they could be fortuitous also, depending on who was in power and who was saying what the comet meant. But most of the time, a star falling from heaven was considered a bad omen. So a comet appears in the year 1148, and under Pope Eugene III, the Council of Reims in 1148 condemned Ian of the Stars movement, saying that it was a heresy. They ordered that Ian be arrested and presented before an ecclesiastical tribunal. So they send a group of agents to arrest Ian of the Stars. The group of agents comes to his movement, they see his extravagant lifestyle, hear his preaching, and far from arresting him, they all become converts to his movement. So they send another group of agents with stern warnings, and they bring Ian of the Stars to the court. This Ian of the Stars was a pretty flamboyant character. When he first was brought before this bishop's council, he carried with him a forked branch. He said that the fork would point heavenward if God was going to take 2/3 of the world and give Ian 1/3 of the world. But if this forked branch pointed toward the earth, then God was going to give Ian of the Stars 2/3 of the world and only keep 1/3 of it for himself. Apparently at this, all of the bishops broke into laughter. But unfortunately, that good humor didn't last for very long. They put Ian to the question. In other words, they sent him to be tortured. He confessed his messiahship. Yes, I am the Messiah. But because many of the bishops considered him insane, they didn't kill him. They instead condemned him to imprisonment at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, where he lived 2 more years and then died in 1150. It's interesting, though, they did not have such mercy on his followers. His followers, whose names were things like wisdom, knowledge, judgment, they were hunted down and also questioned. None of his followers, I don't know if there was a single exception, none of his followers would recant. None of them would disavow Ian of the Stars as their master, and so they were burned at the stake to a man and woman. So for whatever reason, this council in 1148 at Reims marked the end of the bishops' reluctance, possibly through tremendous amount of pressure being exerted on the bishops. They no longer refused to hand heretics over to the secular authorities. So from then on, the way that it worked in the Inquisition, through hundreds of years, was not unlike the story of Jesus in the Gospels. Jesus, if you remember, was tried before the Sanhedrin, a body of priests and rabbis, which did have some judicial authority. But when they decided Jesus was guilty and worthy of death, they did not have the power of capital punishment. They had to hand him over to the secular power of the day, which was the Romans under Pilate, and convince them to put Jesus to death. So just like that, the church would try people. They would judge them worthy of being handed over to the secular authority, which had no scruples against gleefully executing them. And that's how you need to understand the records of the Inquisition trials that you will come across. Bishops could investigate and judge, but they did not have the power to condemn to death. They would tell a relapsed heretic, if you don't repent, if you don't recant, you leave us no choice. Our hands are tied. We're going to have to turn you over to these secular powers where you will be burned alive or killed in some other way. So that was 1148. A few decades later, Pope Lucius III issued the Ad Abolendum. It was called that because its first line was, to the abolishment of various malignant heresies. So this papal bull, the Ad Abolendum in 1184, officially is where most historians pin the beginning of the medieval Inquisition. I have to explain for a second what a papal bull is. A bull is an official decree. It got its name apparently from the bulla, the lead seal on the document. So a papal bull was a document carrying the lead seal of papal authority. And nothing in this particular bull of 1184 was really new. Pope Lucius III required bishops to make judicial inquiry. They had to travel to the various parts of their diocese and look into reports of heresy. This responsibility was placed squarely on the shoulders of the bishops. That's why it was called the Episcopal Inquisition. That's from the Latin word episcopus, watchman, overseer, or what we now call bishops, the regional authorities of the church. And even though it wasn't particularly new, the Ad Abellendum of 1184 reinforced the aggressive stance against heretics that previous councils had already published. And it sent out a specific list of several heretical movements that the bishops had to investigate and root out. That included the Cathars, Waldensians, Humiliati, and others. But functionally, its chief vitriol, its main force, was directed against the Cathars and Catharism. C-A-T-H-A-R, Cathar. Now, you might not come across many Cathars today. In fact, you'd have a very hard time finding any because they were exterminated. They were wiped out in what is described as one of the earliest religious genocides in history. So I guess you'd call that a hericide or aposticide or religiocide. But whatever you call it, the Cathars were wiped off the planet, mainly through the efforts of the Inquisition and its agents and the secular forces, the lords and nobles and knights, who did a lot of the heavy lifting as far as torturing, killing, and burning went. So let's talk about the Cathars for just a moment. Earlier in the episode, I talked about the exposure of Europeans to dualistic philosophies when they went east to the Byzantine Empire. Whether those were remnants of the old Christian Gnosticism or Zoroastrianism, it's hard to say. But the Paulicians, the Bogomils, both had similar views. So the Cathars came back from Europe and adopted a dualistic philosophy, settling mainly in northern Italy and southern France. That was the Cathar stronghold. The Cathars had many beliefs, but unfortunately we have to rely on the records of their sworn enemies to learn what the Cathars believed. The Cathars have no written extant records. They were all destroyed because of their heretical nature. But from what we can gather, the Cathars held several beliefs that were odious in the eyes of the church. Their chief doctrinal fault, as far as the church was concerned, is that they were dualist. They believed in two competing deities, a lot like the Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu of the Zoroastrians. They didn't call them that, but they had two deities, one good, one evil. To the Cathars, the God of the New Testament was the creator of the spiritual realm, and as such, he was the good God. Remember, Gnostic beliefs held that everything in the physical world was evil, and therefore the creator of the physical world was evil. The Cathars adopted that position. Their good God was the God of the spiritual realm, who they believed was revealed in the four Gospels in the New Testament. Standing in opposition to the good spiritual God was the evil physical God, the creator of the physical world. Many Cathars identified the creator of the physical world with the Old Testament God. As such, they differed from the church greatly in thinking that the entire Old Testament talked about the evil deeds of an evil God. What with all its blood and bone physical demands, warlike tendencies, blood sacrifices, genocides, angry threats, strict commandments. To them, that was evidence of an evil physical God, whereas the God of the New Testament was the God of a spiritual realm. These two gods were in opposition, one against the other. Well, as you can imagine, Cathars also believed humans had a spiritual and physical nature. To the Cathars, humans were the sexless spirits of angels who were trapped in the physical world in these evil physical bodies, and that we would be destined to be reincarnated into this world of physical pain, suffering, and evil until our spirits could be liberated from the physical world through what they called the consolamentum, a form of spiritual baptism performed right when death was imminent. So as you can imagine, this led to several other beliefs. One was, since spirits were sexless, women had much more authority and equality in Catharism than they had in Christianity. This is not to go so far as to say that they were equal with men. This was still Europe of the High Middle Ages. But they were a lot closer than the Catholic Church at the time. They also, unfortunately, believed that all bodily pleasures were evil, so in theory anyway, they were ascetic, preferring simple clothing, simple food, vegetarianism, and avoiding sex and other pleasures of the flesh. The interesting thing is, they weren't too strict about this. They were very tolerant of human frailty, but after they were given that sacrament of the consolamentum, then they began to be much more strict in avoiding fleshly pleasures. They called themselves perfecti. And once you became a perfecti, you were expected to avoid those indulgences that you had formerly allowed yourself. And again, remember, we don't have any writings from the Cathars describing what they believe. This is how their beliefs were described by their sworn enemies. But it does seem fairly accurate. So all of those beliefs were considered heretical. But of course, the most threatening thing about the Cathars is they rejected the authority of the Pope. And what's even worse, they rejected the authority of earthly rulers. Now, I need to qualify that. They essentially considered earthly rulers as coming from the realm of the physical, of the flesh, and therefore evil. So even though out of necessity they kept the laws of the land, they considered the spiritual laws of their faith higher than the laws of the land. In their strongholds in southern France, they went so far as to refuse to pay tithes to the Catholic Church and build their own cathedrals. So that's the Cathars, a group that seemed to be a perpetual thorn in the side of the Pope and his church for hundreds of years. In fact, between 1022 and 1163, the Cathars were condemned by no fewer than 8 local church councils. At the Council of Tours in 1163, it was decreed that all Cathars should be thrown into prison and all of their property taken from them. The situation was perpetually dangerous for Cathars if they ever dared to leave their stronghold. In fact, in 1163, 4 Cathar men and a girl traveled from the city of Flanders to Cologne. Cologne at the time was firmly in the grasp of the Holy Roman Empire. So when they were found out to be Cathars, they were taken before the authorities and told to recant, to renounce their Cathar faith. When they refused to do so, 4 men and 1 girl were burned at the stake in the city center in Cologne. Pope Innocent III initially sought a diplomatic solution to the Cathar problem. He tried to work with local leaders of the Cathar lands, but many of these local leaders were themselves Cathars and refused to negotiate with him. So Pope Innocent wasn't having much success with his diplomatic attempts to end Catharism. In fact, case in point, one of the leaders was named Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. In late 1207, Pope Innocent sent one of his representatives, a legate, to negotiate with Raymond of Toulouse. Not only is this legate unsuccessful in changing Raymond's mind, the legate ends up being assassinated on the 15th of January, 1208. It's never proven exactly who assassinated this papal legate, but to Pope Innocent III, it was clearly Raymond of Toulouse or one of his people. So the Pope is tired of the negotiations. He immediately excommunicates Raymond of Toulouse, and he declares a crusade against the Cathars. Now, I need to clarify something that can be confusing. This crusade was called the Albigensian Crusade, not the Cathar Crusade. But that is because the Cathars had settled in great numbers, in a high percentage, in the Albi region of France. That's why it's called the Albigensian Crusade. But make no mistake, this was Catharism that the Pope was fighting in the Albigensian Crusade. Now, having the Pope call a crusade against you was no small thing. It was very, very serious. Because essentially what it meant is that it was open season on you, your family, your lands, and all of your possessions. Any Catholic nobleman who decided to hear the call of the crusade could earn forgiveness of sins, kill you indiscriminately, and then claim all of your lands and property and riches as their own. And that is exactly what happened. Noblemen from the north of France mostly formed an army, and in 1209 they marched on the Albigensians, the Cathars of southern France and northern Italy. And what followed is what usually follows when you combine sadistic, murderous greed with a firm, pious, religious conviction that you can do whatever you want to a certain group of people. In mid-1209, 10,000 crusaders gather in Lyon before marching south. These crusaders were knights with their retinue, professional soldiers, mercenary bands, and pilgrims. They march from Lyon in mid-1209, and one of the first cities they come to is the Cathar stronghold of Béziers. Béziers was a major city. It was well fortified and had enough supplies to withstand a potentially lengthy siege. The Crusader army reaches Béziers on the 21st of July, 1209. It's important to realize that although there were many Cathars living in Béziers, they lived essentially at peace with their Catholic neighbors. There were many Catholics in Béziers as well. So the first person to come out of the city of Béziers to attempt to negotiate with the Crusader army is the Bishop of Béziers. This bishop, Bishop Renaud, tried to avert bloodshed and negotiate with the army. He came back to Béziers with word from the Crusaders that they would not sack the city, they would not destroy Béziers, if Béziers would hand over 222 prominent heretics, mostly all Cathars, 222 individuals who had a position of prominence among the Cathars of the city. Bishop Renaud comes back to the cathedral and he has a meeting with the leaders of the town. They agree that they can't hand over these 222 heretics because they're going to be butchered, and there are people beloved and respected by the members of the community. So this bishop sees the writing on the walls. If they don't hand over these Cathars, the Crusaders are going to destroy the city. So the bishop sees no other way to save the lives of the Cathars in the city except to ask them to leave, flee for their lives. And this, of course, the Cathars refuse to do. So this bishop, Bishop Renaud himself, convinces very few Cathars, just a handful, to leave the town, and he and the Cathars flee before the Crusader army. All of this happens in about a day. The 21st of July. By the 22nd of July, the Crusaders are not yet ready to begin the siege. They're still getting settled, pitching their tents, setting up their camps, when a few armed civilians from the town of Béziers decides this is a good opportunity to go and attack the Crusader army before they're all set up. So in one of the worst military decisions ever, a small group of citizens from Béziers decides to go out and attack the Crusader army before they can get settled in, set up their camp. So, I don't know, I get in my mind a picture of the mayor, the baker, maybe somebody from the post office, although they wouldn't have had a post office, deciding to take the battle to the Crusaders themselves, leaving the safety of the walls of Béziers and attacking the Crusader army. Unfortunately, they had far more zeal than prowess, and they end up attacking some of the mercenaries in the Crusader army. Well, they're very quickly overwhelmed by the mercenaries, and they have to turn tail and flee back into the city of Béziers. Well, to get back in, they had to open the gate. So they're running from the mercenaries, saying, "Open the gate, let us in, quick!" They open the gate, and the mercenaries make it through the gate before they can close the gate again. So before they even have a chance to set up a siege or to engage in any siege warfare or real negotiations for surrender, the mercenaries have entered the city of Béziers, and they very quickly overwhelm the entire city. Well, the Crusader Knights don't want to get left out. They see the mercenaries going into the city and taking all of the good plunder for themselves. So the knights don't want to get left out of the raping, murdering, pillaging, and plundering, and they very quickly enter the city as well. What ensues is a slaughter. The Crusaders rampage through the streets, killing, plundering. The citizens of Béziers who could actually run away in time fled to the churches, where they attempted to hide, but of course the churches did not stop the Crusaders. They broke open the doors of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene and the Church of St. Jude and slaughtered everyone inside. Now, the knights from northern France in the Crusader army very quickly got control of the situation. Don't get me wrong, they didn't get control of the situation in the sense that they stopped the slaughter. They got control, though, of all of the valuables being taken from the city of Béziers. So while the mercenaries were running through town slaughtering everybody, the knights were chiefly concerned with making sure that they got a good share of the valuables. Now, the mercenaries weren't happy with this, so not only did they kill everybody in the city, they expressed their outrage by looting buildings, burning them down, and destroying most of the plunder or throwing it into the river or whatever to make sure the knights couldn't have it. So the whole scene was chaos. Some of what we know about the sacking of Béziers comes from a representative of the Pope named Amalric. Amalric wrote a letter to Pope Innocent III in August of 1209. In that letter, I'll have to explain to you what he's talking about. He talks about the fact that while negotiations were still going on, while the Crusaders were just setting up camp, the undisciplined mob attacked the city of Béziers. He ascribes this to divine providence, and then he describes what he considers the wonderful slaughter that ensued. This is what Amalric writes, quote, "Indeed, because there is no strength nor is there cunning against God, while discussions were still going on with the barons about the release of those in the city who are deemed to be Catholics, the servants and other persons of low rank and unarmed attacked the city without waiting for orders from their leaders. To our amazement, crying, 'To arms, to arms!' Within the space of 2 or 3 hours, they crossed the ditches and the walls, and Béziers was taken. Our men spared no one, irrespective of rank, sex, or age, and put to the sword almost 20,000 people. After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt, as divine vengeance miraculously raged against it." End quote. So a little bit of pious, sadistic glee from Amalric there. We get even more information about these events from the humble prior of a monastery in Heisterbach named Caesarius. This is what Caesarius tells about the massacre. Quote, when they discovered from the admissions of some of them that there were Catholics mingled with the heretics, they said to the abbot, "Sir, what shall we do? For we can't distinguish between the faithful and the heretics." The abbot, like the others, was afraid that many in fear of death would pretend to be Catholics, and after the Crusaders' departure would return to their heresy. Therefore he, the abbot, is said to have replied, "Kill them all, for the Lord knoweth them that are his." And so countless number in that town were slain. End quote. So here we hear this very famous phrase, repeated often, "Kill them all, for God will know his own," or "Kill them all and let God sort them out," possibly used for the first time at the siege of Béziers. But we need to stop and think what he's saying here. This pious abbot knows very well that there are what he would consider good Catholics in the town of Béziers, and that by killing everybody, he will kill the innocent and the guilty as well. But whereas everything in common sense and normal ethics would tell us we really should err on the side of protecting the innocent, he says, no, let's err on the side of punishing the guilty, and if in so doing we kill many faithful Catholics, God will sort them out in the end. That was how cheap life was to these crusaders. Going back to the words of Prior Caesarius again, he writes, quote, "The Crusaders allowed the mercenaries to kill without restraint, women and children, but quickly put a stop to the looting." So again, just more evidence of how cheap life was. You can kill all the people you want, but you better not take our loot, our stash. According to Peter of Vaudreuil-Cernay, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, but another person who wrote about the siege of Béziers, 7,000 people had hidden in the church of St. Magdalene, and all 7,000 were slaughtered. Now, most historians consider Amalric's estimate of 20,000 people slain, or Peter's estimate of 7,000 people being killed in the church of St. Magdalene alone, as being greatly exaggerated. But they still estimate that thousands and thousands of people were killed during the siege of Béziers. As many people as could possibly fit in the church crowded into the church and were slaughtered indiscriminately. So after these miraculous events at Béziers, the Crusader spirits were running high. They turned west toward Carcassonne, about 45 miles away. Many of the famous leaders of the Cathars lived in Carcassonne. Carcassonne was a well-fortified city, and frankly a well-stocked city, but it had a major problem. That is, as the Crusader army approached, hundreds and thousands of refugees entered the city of Carcassonne in an attempt to escape the Crusaders. So Carcassonne was bursting at the seams, and the army of Crusaders was coming fast. It only took them 6 days to travel the 45 miles from Béziers to Carcassonne. They arrived by August 1st, 1209. By August 7, 1209, they'd cut off the city's water supply. With thousands and thousands of people taking refuge in the city of Carcassonne, you can imagine that without water, the siege didn't last long. The leader of the city, Raymond Roger, came out to negotiate under the flag of truce and was immediately taken prisoner by the Crusader army. By August 15th, the people of Carcassonne surrendered. In their mercy, the Crusaders did not slaughter the people of Carcassonne because they had surrendered. And frankly, let's face it, the knights who had traveled in this crusade wanted to get wealthy far more than they wanted to get their swords dirty with slaughtering people. So they confiscated all the property of the people in Carcassonne and forced them to march from the city naked, expelled them from the city. And so while we have to admit that's a tragedy of sorts, they got off easy compared to the people of Béziers. After the falls of Béziers and Carcassonne, most of the other cities in the region surrendered without a fight. And throughout that fall, the Crusaders took control of most of the cities in the region. During this time, the Crusader army was getting better organized, and they appointed a leader named Simon de Montfort, Simon of Montfort, a prominent French nobleman, and he succeeded in rounding up most of the smaller villages and cities in the region. One exception to his success, which I won't go into much, was the castles of the lords of Cabaret, 3 castles, whose lords were closely associated with Cathars, if not Cathars themselves. They resisted Simon's army all through 1209. This, of course, infuriated Simon. He was determined to wipe these castles out. He launched simultaneous attacks on 3 castles, which were all protected by sheer rock faces and defended by a nobleman who was very capable. Simon was a man not to be easily dissuaded. He realized he was failing at capturing the castles. This infuriated him. So Simon de Montfort, the leader of this pious Christian army, And you can tell by the way I say it, it's not going to be good already. Simon de Montfort, the Christian crusader, went to the nearby town of Brum, a town that was defended and protected by the lords of Cabaret. The Crusaders easily overwhelm the town of Brum and take prisoners. And there in Brum, in a public spectacle, Simon gouges out the eyes of the prisoners, then proceeds to cut off their ears, noses, and lips. The luckiest of these unfortunate prisoners was left with one eye and told to go to the castles at Las Tours and tell them to surrender. As you might predict, this ploy totally failed. Pretty stupid when you think about it. If anything, that was going to stiffen their resistance. How likely would you be to surrender to somebody who is likely to gouge out your eyes and cut off many of your sensory organs? While those castles were holding out against Simon and the Pope's Crusader army, Simon went to the town of Minerve, which is a well-fortified city, and he besieged it. That was in June of 1210. The city had no major strategic importance, but Simon wanted to capture it anyway. This town also had quite a bit of fortifying geography, cliffs, heavy rock faces, and so forth around it, so it was very difficult for Simon to capture. So instead of trying to attack it directly, he launched a heavy bombardment with his trebuchets. A couple of weeks after the bombardment started, the main well of the city of Minerva was destroyed. The inhabitants had no water, so they were left with no choice but to surrender to the Crusaders. Now, Simon, to his credit, wanted to be lenient to the townspeople. I don't know, maybe gouging out the eyes, cutting off the ears, and other appendages of the citizens of Brahms had spoiled his appetite for ruthless, barbaric violence. But once again, Abbot Amalric, the one who had written Pope Innocent with all the glories of the siege of Béziers, how men, women, and children were slaughtered, and how it was a wondrous miracle, this same Prior Amalric demanded that Simon, the leader of the Pope's Crusader army, punish the Cathars, and that failing to do so would incur the wrath of God. So after giving them an opportunity to recant, to return to Catholicism, and the Cathars refusing to do so, 140 of them were burned, much to the delight of Amalric. If you look at illustrations or pictures of how this occurred, the way that they would burn the Cathars was designed to prolong and increase their suffering. They were tied to a straight pole by the neck, so their neck was tied to the pole. A small pile of twigs and branches was placed below them. So this was not a raging fire that began instantly to consume them. So the temptation would have been for those being burned to try to hang themselves by the rope around their neck, to try to lean into the rope and choke themselves, strangle themselves before they could be tortured to death by the painful fire. So to prevent them from escaping suffering too early, the executioners would nail a small post that functioned as a seat between their legs. Because of this seat, they couldn't hang themselves from the rope around their neck. They couldn't pull themselves down enough to strangle. So they were forced to endure the suffering of the fire until its work was complete. With that, I'm going to stop talking about all of the various tortures these crusaders inflicted on the Cathars. Just a litany of ingenious cruelty. Of course, the Cathars pushed back, fought even harder, reclaimed some of their lands. The battle went back and forth. It went on from 1209 until 1229. That ended the Albigensian Crusade. But the quest to wipe out the Cathars went on for another 130 years or so, until the Dominican Inquisitor Bernard Gui launched a final offensive against the Cathars, and by 1350, all known remnants of Catharism had been wiped out from Europe. The historian Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide in the 20th century, referred to this crusade, the Albigensian Crusade, as, quote, one of the most conclusive cases of genocide in religious history, end quote. According to Lawrence Marvin, another historian, the Albigensian Crusade might not have been a genocide in the strictest sense of the word. It was more of a religicide. But it does form an important historical precedent for later genocides, including the Holocaust. Now, you may wonder what this all has to do with the early Inquisition. After all, the Albigensian Crusade was not directly under the control of the office of the Inquisition or inquisitors in general. But as we'll find out in the next episode, it was very influential over how the Inquisition was carried out. Because according to the historian Edward Peters, whether we all agree with him or not, he says the violence of the Albigensian Crusade was not in line with the reforms and the plans of Pope Innocent III. Innocent had stressed confession, reform of the clergy and laity, and pastoral teachings to oppose heresy. Peters claims that the violence of the crusade was due to the fact that it was under the control of mobs, petty rulers, and local bishops who did not uphold Pope Innocent's ideas. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I do know that the prior who was writing these letters to Pope Innocent III, Amalric, was gleefully sadistic and did not seem in any way cowed or offended by the brutal violence of the Crusaders. In fact, as the Pope's legate, he himself demanded harsher punishment for the Cathars than the leaders of the crusade often wanted to dole out. But again, according to Edward Peters, the violence and bloodshed of the Albigensian Crusade sparked a desire within the papacy, first under Innocent and then under his successors, to implement greater control over the prosecution of heresy. And it was that desire that instituted a series of legal and technique reforms that would become inquisitorial technique in subsequent ages. In fact, many historians believe that the Inquisition itself was a reaction to the brutal violence of the secular persecution of heretics and Jews. The church wanted to contain, control, and suppress that violence, so it took over the prosecution of heretics primarily with the aim of making it a more humane, a more pastoral, and more effective system. Is that true? Is it not? I don't know. Maybe we'll find out in subsequent episodes. But for now, that concludes this episode of the History of Being Human podcast, the early Episcopal Inquisition and the Albigensian Crusade. This is Noel Armstrong. If you have any questions, comments, write to me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. As always, I would really appreciate it if you would take just a second to scroll down and give us a 5-star rating in your Apple Podcast or whatever podcatcher you listen to. If you haven't done that yet, I'd really appreciate it. And believe me, I understand. Because even as I'm saying this, I realize that I myself listen to 10 or 15 podcasts. I've probably only given 1 or 2 a rating, and none of them a review. So I'm going to go remedy that right now. If you could give me a review and a rating, I also appreciate it. And remember, we're just getting started in our discussion of the Inquisition, only covering its very earliest iterations in the late 12th and early 13th century, and then, of course, the Albigensian Crusade. Next time, we'll talk about some of the other heretical groups, although it might not be easy to match the flamboyance of Éon de l'Étoile, the magic glowing messiah, but we'll do our best. Until then, be well.